It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Alan Broadbent. As I mentioned, Alan is the chairman of Maytree. He's also the chairman and CEO of Avana Capital. He provides leadership and governance to organizations that have made tremendous impact on poverty in Canada, in particular the Caledon Institute, the Tamarack Institute, and the Institute for Municipal Finance and Governance. He's also an author. As an urbanist, he published Urban Nation a few years ago. He's also the co-editor of 5 Good Ideas, the book. And hopefully many of you are familiar with the 5 Good Ideas coming out of Maytree. He's also been recognized nationally as a member of the Order of Canada. He's also received honorary doctorates from Ryerson and Queen's. Please join me in welcoming Alan Broadbent.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everybody. I want to join Elizabeth in welcoming you on behalf of Maytree and the Maytree team. We know how busy that you all are, and we appreciate the time that you've taken to come and be with us today, and we hope you find the discussions useful that'll occur over the rest of the day. When Judy and I founded Maytree 35 years ago, we had a small amount of money to put into the foundation, so we knew that we had to focus on places we thought we could make a difference. We knew we wanted to focus on anti-poverty work, and so we sought out places where a small amount of money could help. Our first main focus was on literacy, because we knew that illiteracy not only increased the chance someone would become poor, but that it prevented them from participating in any efforts to improve their systemic treatment in society. We funded a lot of community-based adult literacy programs in places across Canada. That work led us into the immigrant community because many of the best learners in literacy programs are immigrants and refugees, and we discovered along the way that they had a whole suite of other needs in order to settle successfully and to succeed. Many of you will be familiar with that theme of our work. As we were able over the years to put more money into the work of Maytree, we discovered that even then we didn't have enough to solve the problems we aimed at. And as I looked around at the grant-making sector in Canada and in the US, where I was quite active, I came to the conclusion that even the biggest donors could barely make a dent in the biggest problems. So we knew that we had to find some way to leverage our grants, to find bigger levers to pull. That led us, as Elizabeth suggested, to the co-founding of the Caledon Institute of Social Policy to work at the level of public policy. Public budgets constitute one of the biggest levers, and Caledon's work on income supports has had a material effect on the lives of low-income Canadians. It also led us to co-founding the Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement, whose work on collective impact and collaborative activity has exercised another big lever, and that is the power of communities working together. Both Caledon and Tamarack signify that what we do collectively is more powerful than isolated or individual actions. Our experience with these two organizations informed much of our subsequent activity, which aimed at the big systems: government policy and the regulatory environment, corporate policy, particularly regarding employment practices, and the way key institutions like the criminal justice and police systems work. I'd like to offer 3 observations of lessons I think we've learned along the way. And the first is in the value of creating connections. In the various areas we've worked, we've seen some great work being done by bright and committed people. Very often, they don't know the other people working in their own field, or only know the people locally. Often, particularly in the charitable sector, this is because they're working too hard in underfunded organizations. They're stretched too far, they're wearing too many hats, and they're responding to unrelenting demands. To look up, to glance around, to take some time off for study or contemplation are simply unaffordable luxuries. In other cases, where there are fewer pressures, the places to meet are few and far between. We learned early on at Maytree that one of the things we could contribute was the creation of a meeting place, in effect a safe house for people to meet. And we've had the privilege of having many of you in this room meet in our boardroom over a sandwich or in a conference room like this. And we've always been surprised at how often people we thought knew each other didn't, or groups we thought were working together weren't, or people we thought were collaborators thought of themselves as competitors for the public good. And of course, this is understandable. Too much work and pressure to make clients' lives better, too little funding, and often competitive processes set up by funders who very often seem to crave that competition, a condition that governments and foundations are too often guilty of. But this kind of isolation and competition is not ideal, as we all know, and it doesn't make us stronger. What we found is that colleagues can exist in the darndest places. An example from my friend Alet Mansky at Plan. When Plan was developing the Registered Disability Savings Plan, they anticipated that one of the toughest groups to get on side would be federal finance bureaucrats. They thought that for good reasons, and they weren't far off the mark. Except for a couple of them, gnarled veterans of the public service who stepped forward to help in very practical ways because they thought the RDSP was a good idea and a good instrument, and they knew what design would work and how to get it done. I like the idea, and we think of this often at Maytree, of a points of light strategy, looking for people who want to achieve what we want, have talent and energy, are making progress, and then connecting them to each other. So thus the name of our conference today, Connecting for Change. The second observation will come as no surprise to you, and that is the importance of working to change systems. That is part of our interest in policy work, in collective impact, and now in human rights, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. Sometimes systems are fractured, and sometimes they're just mediocre. But they're always hard to change because they have defenders and stakeholders. We're currently looking at some of the elements, for example, of the criminal justice system, particularly what happens to people regarding bail and remand. Most people agree that too many young people in their first brush with the law are being incarcerated unreasonably, which robs them of life chances to straighten out. The system is full of conflicting interests. Crown attorneys, judges, and justices of the peace trying to avoid public embarrassment of having someone on bail commit a serious offense, a bogglingly rare occurrence. Police intent on getting arrest rates up and intimidating gang culture. Duty counsels juggling too many cases even as they're trying to keep their clients out of jail. And Justice Department bureaucrats worry of the unintended consequences of any large-scale change. But the system is fractured. Lives are being ruined. Young people with a chance of straightening out are being kept for unreasonable amounts of time in what is really the ideal school for criminal recruitment, jail. Now, it's impressive to us how many people are working to change this, some of whom are on the program here today. But it's heavy lifting because of the power of some of the elements. Lawyers and judges, the lack of sympathy for the victims, very often young men of color, and the volatility of the issue in the public eye. But little will change without system change. There are a few JPs, a few Crown counsels, and some duty counsel taking initiative to help these young people avoid getting pushed even further down the wrong path. But they are the tail trying to wag the dog. Our hope is that the advocates for change coming together can push at those capable of implementing systems change, the ministers and deputy ministers of justice and senior judges. Now, when I talk about working at the systems level, I do not want for a moment to disparage those who are not overtly working on systems change, for I know that working on the ground at the coalface of misery and deprivation is fundamental and necessary. In fact, without that work, there is no other way to make the case for system change. One feeds the other. Each needs to be aware of the other and to work in the context of the other, but we need both. My final observation is perhaps an odd place to start the day, but it is to celebrate anti-poverty work in Canada. I know that those of us in the work can often look around and not see anything that has changed in the past few decades. You often hear that said, or even that things have gotten worse, and we've particularly heard that in the last decade. We've come at fighting poverty over the years from various perspectives in Canada. There have been the economic and community wealth building approaches, which point out that what poverty costs society in terms of lost productivity and remedial costs. There's been the social justice approach that points out how unequally we start out because of income, disability, race, or gender, and looks for ways to level that playing field. And there's been the moral approach, which laments our toleration of people living in misery and without hope, and asks how we can treat other human beings in this way. All of these approaches have borne success. We've implemented measures like the Canada Child Tax Benefit and the Working Income Tax Benefit, which have made a real difference to people's ability to lead productive lives. We've broadened out other benefits, and we increase their increments regularly, mainly through having them indexed to inflation. They're still mostly underfunded, and we could make huge strides against poverty by merely funding them properly, but without them, we would be very much worse off. Social justice arguments have swayed opinion and given our governments permission, and some businesses inspiration, to level the playing field. And many people have been swayed to more generosity, whether it be church groups feeding the poor, or the recent explosion of compassion for the Syrian refugees. Those who have been toiling in the field can be proud of the results of this work. And from Maytree's perspective, we admire the durability and relentless effort of people committed to anti-poverty work. A further approach, and Elizabeth referred to this in her opening remarks, less used in Canada, has been to look at human rights as a way of fighting poverty. And this is interesting to Maytree. Rights have many attractions. If something is a right, it's less vulnerable to choices that governments or others might make. If, for example, there is a right to decent housing, the underhoused can stop being supplicants for public housing and demand to be shown to their home. Canada, as we know, is governed by rights, by our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's also signatory to international rights covenants, paramount among them the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, where is the anniversary today from its adoption by the General Assembly 67 years ago. And it's interesting to note that the principal drafter of the UN Declaration was a Canadian, John Humphrey. The Canadian Charter was passed in Parliament in 1982 and was concerned mostly with legal and political rights. It did not contain social or economic rights. Social rights concern things like safe and affordable housing, health and healthy living conditions, safe and nutritious food, and education. Economic rights include the opportunity for well-paid work in good conditions, for economic security for those unable to work, and the right for workers to organize. The UN Declaration does include social and economic rights, as do many rights regimes around the world. Canada is an outlier in not having them. At the time of the Charlottetown Accord in 1992, 10 years after we adopted our charter, a social charter was included that contains some social and economic rights, but as we know, the accord was defeated in a referendum, so we still do not have social and economic rights in Canada. But we do have obligations because we signed the UN Declaration and other international covenants, and in many cases, Canada has simply not been living up to those obligations. Maytree is looking at what would be required to include social and economic rights in our charter. We want to understand better what impact inclusion might have, particularly in the fight against poverty. Would governments be required to act differently? For example, would the continued underfunding of our income support and income replacement programs be able to continue, or might the courts require full funding? Would low wages and insecure working conditions be sustainable? Would poor access to health for people living in remote places be able to continue? Many of you here today work in rights and are way ahead of us in understanding the dimensions of the questions and the directions in which the answers might lie. We hope to be able to learn from you and in turn to connect you with others whose work might contribute to yours. And many of you have not been working in the rights context, but you may be interested in knowing whether it might add to your effectiveness, or at least be an ally in achieving our shared anti-poverty goals. My colleague, Elizabeth McIsaac, who, as she indicated, is the president of Maytree, is leading our investigation on the rights lens on anti-poverty work and has more to say on our directions and our thinking, and also more to tell you about the conference today. So it's now my pleasure to turn the podium back over to Elizabeth. Thank you very much.